Corporal Ethan Bonner had faced countless dangerous missions throughout his military career, but nothing could have prepared him for what awaited on the desolate planet Sci-Fi. The planet had been abandoned for centuries, according to the Galactic Council, and it had no recorded inhabitants. Yet recently, strange signals had begun to emanate from it, sophisticated communications that couldn't be traced. The Council, nervous about what might be lurking there, sent Bonner's squad to investigate. What they didn't know was that this mission would change everything. As Bonner and his team landed on the dusty surface of Typhoria, they noticed something strange. The planet's landscape was eerily quiet, with towering rock formations and dense forests, but no signs of life. The air was thick with the scent of unknown plants, and the distant mountains looked as though they were frozen in time. Bonner surveyed the area through his visor, trying to catch any unusual movement. It was too quiet. His gut told him that something was off. Without warning, the ground trembled beneath them, and the team was hit with a sudden, violent attack. The cloaked alien drones appeared out of nowhere, their sleek metal bodies shimmering as they activated their deadly weapons. The squad was thrown into chaos, with soldiers firing their weapons blindly at the invisible enemy. The drones moved with precision, their cloaking technology making them almost impossible to see until it was too late. One by one, Bonner's men fell, their screams echoing across the barren landscape. As Bonner took cover behind a rock, his heart pounded in his chest. He could hear the sounds of combat all around him. Gunfire, explosions, and the eerie whirring of the alien drones. He tried to make contact with his team, but his comms were down. His squad was scattered, and he was alone. With every passing second, it seemed like the drones were closing in on him, and the fear of being hunted by invisible enemies began to set in. Just as he thought it was over, something unexpected happened. A flash of light appeared before him, and before he could react, a powerful force struck the drone attacking him, sending it flying into the air with a deafening crash. Bonner jumped to his feet, his weapon ready, but what he saw next froze him in his tracks. A woman, a stunning, otherworldly woman stood before him, her body glowing with an ethereal light. She was tall, with radiant lavender skin that seemed to shimmer in the light. Her silver hair cascaded down her back like liquid metal, and her eyes, violet and deep as the night sky, stared directly at him. She moved with a fluid grace, her every step filled with purpose, her presence as powerful as it was mesmerizing. The drones around them faltered, seemingly aware of her presence. "Who are you?" Bonner demanded, still holding his weapon but unable to look away from her. The woman didn't answer immediately. Instead, she raised her hand, and the remaining drones surrounding them were deactivated with a mere flick of her wrist. The sight was almost too much to comprehend. This alien, whoever she was, had taken control of the battlefield as if it was nothing. "You can call me Lady Xyra," she finally spoke, her voice soft yet commanding. There was an undeniable strength in her tone, like a calm before a storm. "I've been watching you, human." Bonner's mind raced. He had never encountered an alien like her before. She was beautiful, otherworldly, and somehow she seemed different. There was a strange pull in the air around her, something magnetic that made Bonner feel both threatened and intrigued at the same time. "Why are you here?" Bonner asked, lowering his weapon slightly, though he didn't trust this strange woman one bit. Lady Xyra's violet eyes softened, and she took a step closer. "I am here to offer you a proposition, a proposal for the future of both our species." Bonner's brows furrowed in confusion. What kind of proposal could an alien possibly have for him? And more importantly, why did he feel this strange, almost overwhelming attraction to her? It was as if his entire body was reacting to her presence, his heart racing, his palms sweating. The battle around him, the chaos, seemed to fade into the background as if nothing else mattered. "You've come to a dying world, human," Xyra continued, her voice steady. "My people, the Virecti, are facing extinction. We have lost our ability to reproduce, and the survival of our species depends on finding a new path. Bonner didn't know what to say. He had heard of the Virecti before, an ancient alien race known for their incredible strength and advanced technology. But he had no idea they were in such a desperate situation. "You want us to help you?" Bonner asked, still skeptical. "Why me? Why now?" Zyra's eyes met his with a strange intensity. "You humans are more resilient than any species we've encountered. Your genetics, they are unique. Our scientists believe that your kind could save us. I want you, human, to father our future. Let me carry your babies." The words hung in the air like a heavy weight. Bonner stood frozen, his mind reeling. Was this a trick? Was she serious? He tried to process her words, but the tension in the air, the strange chemistry between them, made it hard to think clearly. Before he could respond, the ground shook once again, louder this time, and the sounds of approaching enemy forces filled the air. Lady Zyra turned her head toward the horizon, her eyes narrowing as she prepared for what was coming next. "We don't have much time," she said, her voice urgent now. "The Nethrians, our enemies, are closing in. They've been hunting us for years, and they'll stop at nothing to destroy what's left of us." Bonner's heart raced, not just from the danger that was closing in, but from the overwhelming question that haunted his mind. What kind of future could he possibly have with this alien woman? And more importantly, could he trust her? As the sky above darkened, Bonner had a choice to make. Would he join forces with this mysterious alien beauty and help save her species, or would he find a way to survive this mission alone? Little did he know, this was just the beginning of an extraordinary journey that would change everything. Bonner was still trying to process everything. The battle had just ended, and now he was alone with Lady Zyra, the alien woman who had saved his life, and in the process, made an extraordinary claim. Her words repeated in his mind like an echo. "Let me carry your babies, human." He couldn't quite understand why she would ask such a thing, but there was no mistaking the intensity in her voice. Her offer was unlike anything he had ever encountered before. "Why me?" Bonner asked, still struggling to comprehend her proposition. "Why would you want this? What are you asking from me?" Lady Zyra gave him a long, meaningful look. Her eyes shimmered with the colors of a distant galaxy, and for a moment, Bonner thought he saw a deep sadness behind them. She wasn't just some cold, calculated alien. There was something more to her. She wasn't the enemy, but the weight of her people's plight seemed to hang on her shoulders like a heavy burden. "We are dying, human," she finally said, her voice softer now. "The Virecti can no longer reproduce. We have tried everything, but our species is fading. We need your help to survive. You are human. Your species is adaptable, strong, and resilient. You are our last hope." Bonner took a step back, unsure how to respond. This situation was like nothing he had ever encountered before. He was a soldier, trained to fight, to protect, but never to be part of something like this. He had come to Sci-Fi to do his job, to investigate and neutralize threats. But now, he was faced with an alien who seemed to believe that the future of her entire species depended on him. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. His mind was racing. How could he possibly say yes to something so impossible? He looked at Zyra, and for the first time, he truly saw her. She wasn't just a beautiful alien. She was someone who was clearly desperate, someone who needed him. He felt his heart skip a beat. She was strong, powerful, but there was vulnerability in her, a raw emotion that made her seem more human than alien. "You don't understand," she continued, her voice trembling slightly. "The Nethrians, the ones who attacked us, they want to wipe us out. We've been running, hiding, but we can't do it forever. And we can't survive without help. The Virecti need to rebuild. We need your genetics, your strength, to give us a chance." Bonner felt the weight of her words. He had always known that humanity was special, but he had never realized how much other species might see them as a last resort, as a key to their survival. It was a strange feeling, almost overwhelming. But it was also a call to action. Something deep within him told him he couldn't walk away from. Bonner nodded, matching her speed as they pushed forward. The air was thick, and each breath felt like it was being pulled from deep within him. His heart raced as he thought of the Nethrians, the enemy that had driven Hyra and her people to this desperate point. He had heard rumors about their ruthless tactics and their technologically superior army, but hearing it from Hyra herself made it all too real. They weren't just after resources or power. They'd wanted to eradicate her species. How much farther? Bonner asked, trying to keep his mind focused on the task at hand. Not much, Zyra answered, her voice barely above a whisper. The cave system is hidden under the cliffs to the west, but if we don't hurry, we'll be caught in the open. Bonner looked ahead, squinting against the bright light filtering through the trees. The jungle was dense and treacherous, and there was no easy way to navigate it. But it wasn't just the environment that posed a threat. It was the unknown. The Nethrians could be anywhere. They had superior technology, and Bonner knew that the moment they were spotted, they wouldn't stand a chance. He had trained for this, but nothing could have prepared him for the feeling of being hunted on an alien world. As they continued on, Bonner's mind kept drifting back to Hyra. She was strong, intelligent, and beautiful. But there was something more. He had noticed the way her shoulders had tensed when she spoke about the Nethrians, the way her jaw clenched when she mentioned her people's impending extinction. She wasn't just trying to survive for herself. She was fighting for the future of an entire species. And in that moment, Bonner realized just how much responsibility she carried. "Do you think we can make it?" he asked, though he knew it wasn't just a question about the caves. He wanted to know if they could survive this, if they could actually fight back and make a difference. Styra didn't answer immediately. Instead, she paused, taking in a deep breath as she scanned the surroundings. Her eyes narrowed, and Bonner could tell she was listening for something. She lifted her hand and gestured for him to stop. "Quiet," she whispered urgently, her voice barely audible. Bonner froze, every muscle in his body tensed. He strained his ears, listening intently, but all he could hear was the soft rustling of the trees and the faint sounds of wildlife in the distance. Then, through the silence, a new sound emerged: footsteps. Slow and deliberate, the unmistakable sound of a patrol moving through the jungle. The Nethrians were close. Zyra's eyes flicked toward Bonner, and she motioned for him to crouch. They both sank down, pressing their bodies against the ground. As the footsteps drew nearer, Bonner's heart pounded in his chest as he held his breath. The tension between them was palpable, a shared understanding that survival was now a game of silence and speed. Through the thick foliage, Bonner could just make out the faint silhouette of a Nethrian soldier. The creature was tall, clad in sleek black armor, its advanced helmet giving it an almost robotic appearance. It moved with military precision, scanning the area with a weapon held at the ready. The Nethrians were not to be underestimated. They were deadly, their weapons capable of tearing through any defense. Bonner's fingers tightened around his weapon, but he knew better than to make a move. They couldn't fight the Nethrians head-on. Not yet, not with their limited resources. He glanced at Zyra, who was watching the Nethrians with cold, calculating eyes. Her face was set in a mask of determination, but Bonner could see the fear flickering beneath it. She knew the stakes, and she knew that one wrong move could mean their end. The Nethrian soldier stopped just a few meters away, its helmet scanning the ground. Bonner's pulse raced as he held perfectly still, praying they wouldn't be spotted. The seconds felt like hours, each one dragging on in slow motion. Finally, the soldier took a step forward, continuing its patrol, and Bonner let out a quiet exhale of relief. But Sarah wasn't done. She tapped Bonner on the shoulder, signaling for him to follow her as she began to move stealthily through the underbrush. They couldn't afford to wait around any longer. The Nethrians had already shown their ability to track, and it wouldn't be long before they realized someone was on their tail. As they moved quickly but silently, the weight of the situation began to settle in on Bonner. He was no longer just a soldier on a mission. He was part of something far bigger. The choices he made now, the alliances he formed, could determine the fate of an entire species. He stole a glance at Syra again, watching her as she led him through the jungle. Her eyes were focused, her every move deliberate. She wasn't just leading him through the jungle. She was leading him into a war. The stakes had never been higher, and the tension between them was mounting. If they didn't make it to the caves soon, they would be fighting for their lives in the open. Bonner felt a sense of urgency rise within him. The Nethrians were closing in, and they were about to find out just how far Bonner and Syra were willing to go to survive. The alliance between them had only just begun, but it was already being tested in ways neither of them could have imagined. Every step, every breath they took now felt like it could be their last. But in that moment, as they moved deeper into the jungle, Bonner realized that no matter what came next, he wasn't alone. Syra, for all her strength and wisdom, had become his ally, and maybe something more. The path ahead was uncertain, but together they would face whatever came their way. And if the Nethrians had any idea what was about to hit them, they would be in for a fight like no other. The jungle was dense, its thick trees towering over Bonner and Syra as they moved cautiously through the underbrush. The air felt heavy, each breath a struggle as they trekked onward, but the silence between them was deafening. There was something more than just the dangers of the jungle that weighed on their minds now. The Nethrians were closing in. Their pursuit was relentless. It was only a matter of time before they would be found. Bonner's mind raced. He wasn't used to this kind of danger, this kind of tension. Back home, on Earth, the battles he fought were clear-cut, strategic. But here, on this alien planet, everything felt different. The Nethrians weren't just an enemy. They were a force of nature. Their advanced technology made them nearly unstoppable, and it seemed like they were always one step ahead. With every passing moment, Bonner realized how much was riding on this mission, not just for him and Syra, but for the entire future of her people. Syra seemed unfazed by the mounting pressure. Her eyes were sharp, her movements quick and quiet, as if she had lived in the shadow of danger for her entire life. Bonner couldn't help but admire her strength. She had seen the worst of what the Nethrians had done to her people, yet she still held on to hope. But as they continued through the dense jungle, something shifted in her. Her pace quickened, and Bonner could see a growing unease in her eyes. She wasn't just worried anymore. She was afraid. "Syra, what's wrong?" Bonner asked, his voice low and urgent. Syra didn't respond at first. She kept walking, her eyes scanning the environment, her ears listening for the slightest sound of movement. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "The Nethrians aren't just hunting us. They're hunting you, Bonner." Bonner stopped dead in his tracks. His heart skipped a beat. What did she mean? The Nethrians had been after her people for years, ever since they had arrived on this planet. But him, a human, he couldn't understand why they would be hunting him. "What do you mean, hunting me?" he asked, confusion and concern flooding his words. Syra turned to face him, her eyes filled with a mix of fear and determination. "They know who you are, Bonner. They know what you're capable of. Your kind has a unique ability. Your strength. Your will to fight. The Nethrians have never faced anything like you before." Bonner's mind raced as he tried to make sense of what she was saying. He had been trained to fight, to survive, but he hadn't known that his mere presence could be a threat to the Nethrians. He wasn't anything special, just a soldier doing his job. But to the Nethrians, he was something different, something dangerous. "I don't understand," Bonner muttered, looking down at his weapon, as if the answer might lie there. "Why me? I'm just a soldier." Syra stepped closer, lowering her voice. "The Nethrians don't just fight for victory, they fight for control. And if they can eliminate you, eliminate humanity. They will. Bonner's blood ran cold at her words. It wasn't just about this mission anymore. It wasn't just about him or Xira. It was about something bigger. The survival of humanity was at stake. The Nethrians had set their sights on Earth, and if they succeeded, the consequences would be unimaginable. "We can't let that happen," Bonner said, his voice firm with determination. Xira gave him a hard look, her expression unreadable. "I never said we would. But we can't do it alone." Bonner understood then. This wasn't just about surviving the jungle or escaping the Nethrians. This was about forming an alliance that could potentially change the course of the war. He wasn't just fighting for his life now. He was fighting for the future of his people. But as they moved deeper into the jungle, they could feel the Nethrians closing in. It was as if they were being stalked by shadows, every rustle in the trees, every footstep in the distance, sending a chill down their spines. The Nethrians were everywhere, lurking in the darkness, waiting for the right moment to strike. Bonner knew that if they didn't make it to the cave system soon, they would be trapped. Xira stopped suddenly, her sharp eyes catching movement in the distance. Bonner instinctively dropped to the ground, his heart racing. She was already moving toward the source of the noise, her movements swift and silent. He followed, keeping low and out of sight. They reached a clearing, and Bonner's breath caught in his throat as he saw what lay ahead. A group of Nethrians, their armor glinting in the dim light, stood in a circle around a campfire. They were talking, their harsh voices harshly cutting through the air. Bonner could hear them clearly now, their words filled with malice and anger. They were hunting. And they weren't just hunting Xira anymore. They were hunting humanity. Xira's face hardened as she observed the Nethrians. She motioned for Bonner to stay still, her eyes locked on the enemy. She was calculating, formulating a plan. Bonner could see the wheels turning in her mind as she thought of their next move. They couldn't fight them directly. There were too many of them, but they could outsmart them. They could use the jungle to their advantage. Xira turned to Bonner, her gaze intense. "This is it," she whispered. "We make our move now, or we'll never make it to the caves." Bonner nodded, his heart pounding in his chest. This was the turning point, the moment that would determine their fate. It was now or never. They couldn't afford to fail. With one final look at the Nethrians, Xira took off, her movements swift and silent. Bonner followed close behind, each step calculated, each breath shallow. The jungle had become their battlefield, and the Nethrians were the enemy. But this time, they weren't the underdogs. They were the hunters, and the Nethrians didn't even know it. The turning point had arrived. The air in the jungle had changed. It was no longer just a place of refuge. It had become their battleground. Bonner's heart was racing as he crouched low behind a thick cluster of trees, his pulse hammering in his ears. The Nethrians were close now, just a few meters ahead. Xira was beside him, her eyes scanning the area with laser focus, every muscle tense and ready for action. "We don't have much time," Xira whispered, her voice barely audible. She was looking at the path ahead, where a small clearing had opened up. "We need to take them out before they send word back to their main camp. If they get reinforcements, we're done." Bonner nodded, understanding the gravity of their situation. This wasn't just a skirmish anymore. The Nethrians had become personal enemies. They had pursued them across the jungle, forcing them to fight for every step. But now, the final showdown was here, and there was no turning back. Xira led the way, her movements swift and silent, as she expertly maneuvered through the dense underbrush. Bonner followed close behind, his instincts telling him that they were being watched. It wasn't just the Nethrians they had to worry about anymore. The jungle itself seemed to be alive, its every sound amplified in the stillness, adding to the tension that hung thick in the air. As they reached the clearing, Bonner's eyes locked onto the Nethrians. 5 of them, armed with weapons that glinted menacingly in the dim light. They were unaware of Bonner and Cyrus' presence, focused on scanning the perimeter for any signs of movement. Bonner's fingers tightened around the grip of his weapon, but he didn't make a move. Not yet. He knew the slightest noise could give them away. Bonner understood then. This wasn't just about surviving the jungle or escaping the Nethrians. This was about forming an alliance that could potentially change the course of the war. He wasn't just fighting for his life now. He was fighting for the future of his people. But as they moved deeper into the jungle, they could feel the Nethrians closing in. It was as if they were being stalked by shadows. Every rustle in the trees, every footstep in the distance, sending a chill down their spines. The Nethrians were everywhere, lurking in the darkness, waiting for the right moment to strike. Bonner knew that if they didn't make it to the cave system soon, they would be trapped. Zyra stopped suddenly, her sharp eyes catching movement in the distance. Bonner instinctively dropped to the ground, his heart racing. She was already moving toward the source of the noise, her movements swift and silent. He followed, keeping low and out of sight. They'd reached a clearing, and Bonner's breath caught in his throat as he saw what lay ahead. A group of Nethrians, their armor glinting in the dim light, stood in a circle around a campfire. They were talking, their harsh voices harshly cutting through the air. Bonner could hear them clearly now, their words filled with malice and anger. They were hunting. And they weren't just hunting Zyra anymore. They were hunting humanity. Zyra's face hardened as she observed the Nethrians. She motioned for Bonner to stay still, her eyes locked on the enemy. She was calculating, formulating a plan. Bonner could see the wheels turning in her mind as she thought of their next move. They couldn't fight them directly. There were too many of them, but they could outsmart them. They could use the jungle to their advantage. Zyra turned to Bonner, her gaze intense. "This is it," she whispered. "We make our move now, or we'll never make it to the caves." Bonner nodded, his heart pounding in his chest. This was the turning point, the moment that would determine their fate. It was now or never. They couldn't afford to fail. With one final look at the Nethrians, Zyra took off, her movements swift and silent. Bonner followed close behind, each step calculated, each breath shallow. The jungle had become their battlefield, and the Nethrians were the enemy. But this time, they weren't the underdogs. They were the hunters, and the Nethrians didn't even know it. The turning point had arrived. The air in the jungle had changed. It was no longer just a place of refuge. It had become their battleground. Bonner's heart was racing as he crouched low behind a thick cluster of trees, his pulse hammering in his ears. The Nethrians were close now, just a few meters ahead. Zyra was beside him, her eyes scanning the area with laser focus, every muscle tense and ready for action. "We don't have much time," Zyra whispered, her voice barely audible. She was looking at the path ahead, where a small clearing had opened up. "We need to take them out before they send word back to their main camp. If they get reinforcements, we're done." Bonner nodded, understanding the gravity of their situation. This wasn't just a skirmish anymore. The Nethrians had become personal enemies. They had pursued them across the jungle, forcing them to fight for every step. But now, the final showdown was here, and there was no turning back. Zyra led the way, her movements swift and silent as she expertly maneuvered through the dense underbrush. Bonner followed close behind, his instincts telling him that they were being watched. It wasn't just the Nethrians they had to worry about anymore. The jungle itself seemed to be alive, its every sound amplified in the stillness, adding to the tension that hung thick in the air. As they reached the clearing, Bonner's eyes locked onto the Nethrians, 5 of them, armed with weapons that glinted menacingly in the dim light. They were unaware of Bonner and Zyra's presence, focused on scanning the perimeter for any signs of movement. Bonner's fingers tightened around the grip of his weapon, but he didn't make a move. Not yet. He knew the slightest noise could give them away. Zyra looked at him and gave a small nod, signaling that it was time. They had no other choice but to act now. With a sudden burst of speed, Syra darted into the clearing, her movements fluid and precise. She threw a small device to the ground, which emitted a sharp, high-pitched noise that disoriented the Nethrians. They looked around, confused, trying to locate the source of the sound. In that split second of distraction, Bonner made his move. He charged forward, his footsteps heavy but calculated. The Nethrians' heads snapped in his direction as he closed the distance, but it was too late. Bonner fired his weapon, sending a pulse of energy straight into one of the Nethrians, who crumpled to the ground instantly. The remaining four turned to face him, their eyes filled with rage and disbelief. Syra moved like a shadow, striking from behind with deadly precision. She didn't need words to communicate. Her actions spoke louder than anything she could say. She had spent her life in the shadows, fighting for survival, and now she was fighting for something bigger. Together, they were a force to be reckoned with. Bonner's weapon fired again, and another Nethrian fell, the energy blast leaving a scorch mark on the ground. But the remaining Nethrians were experienced warriors. They fought back, their weapons lighting up with energy as they returned fire. Bonner ducked behind a thick tree trunk, the energy blasts hitting the ground near him, sending up showers of dirt and debris. Syra was already moving, using her agility to stay one step ahead of their attackers. The jungle around them seemed to close in, the sounds of the battle echoing through the trees. Every movement felt amplified, every breath a battle against the overwhelming tension. Bonner could feel his heart racing as he peeked around the tree, taking aim once more. But the Nethrians were fast. They moved as one, their coordination nearly flawless. They had fought in countless battles. But this time, it was different. This time, they weren't fighting a faceless enemy. They were fighting for their very survival. One of the Nethrians turned, aiming directly at Syra. Bonner's instincts kicked in. He shouted her name, but she didn't need to hear it. She was already moving, twisting in midair as she dodged the incoming blast. In the blink of an eye, she was on top of her attacker, her blade slicing through the air. With a swift motion, she disabled him, her movements so fluid they seemed almost effortless. Bonner's eyes widened in admiration. Syra wasn't just a survivor. She was a warrior, every bit as deadly as the Nethrians she fought against. They were more than just allies now. They were a team. And together, they had the strength to take on the impossible. But the fight wasn't over yet. The last two Nethrians were still standing, their eyes filled with hate as they advanced. Bonner could feel the heat of the battle in his bones, his muscles burning with the effort. But he couldn't stop now. Not when everything they had worked for was on the line. Syra glanced at him, her face a mask of determination. They didn't speak. It wasn't necessary. They knew what had to be done. With a quick signal, she charged forward, drawing the attention of the remaining Nethrians. Bonner used the opportunity to flank them, moving quickly and quietly. He could hear the sounds of the Nethrians shouting, their voices distorted by the jungle. But this time, they weren't as organized. They were rattled, desperate. Bonner and Syra's movements were synchronized, each strike purposeful, each movement precise. The final Nethrian turned to face Bonner, his weapon raised. But Bonner was faster. He fired one last shot, hitting his target square in the chest. The Nethrian staggered back, falling to the ground with a loud thud. The clearing fell silent, the battle finally over. Bonner stood there, breathing heavily, his weapon still raised, just in case there were any more surprises. But there were no more enemies. They had done it. Syra stood beside him, her face covered in dirt and blood, but her eyes were filled with something else. Triumph. "We did it," she said softly, as if still processing the reality of their victory. Bonner nodded, a sense of relief flooding over him. They had won, but there was no time to rest. The battle had only been one part of a much larger war. And now, they were ready for whatever came next. The jungle was quiet now, the battle finally over. Bonner stood among the fallen Nethrians, his heart still racing, the adrenaline slowly beginning to wear off. He could hear the soft rustling of the trees around them, the distant calls of creatures in the wild. The tension in the air had shifted. The chaos of the fight had given way to something else, a kind of peace. Zyra walked over to him, her movements slow, deliberate. The dirt and blood on her face only made her look more fierce, more determined. But there was something softer in her eyes now, something Bonner hadn't seen before. Maybe it was relief, or perhaps it was something more. Bonner lowered his weapon and looked around, his thoughts a little more clear. They had won, but what did that mean? The Nethrians were gone, their forces scattered, but the war wasn't over. It had never been just about this one fight. It was about something much bigger, a fight for survival, for freedom. "We did it," Zyra said, her voice quiet but filled with a sense of finality. "The Nethrians won't be back for a while. Not after this." Bonner nodded, though a part of him still felt uncertain. "It's over for now," he said, his voice hoarse. "But I can't shake the feeling that something else is coming. The Nethrians might be defeated, but we've made enemies. Bigger enemies." Zyra paused, looking at him with a mixture of understanding and concern. She had been in this fight long enough to know that there was always a bigger threat lurking in the shadows. The universe was vast, and their victory here might just be a small ripple in a much larger storm. "We'll be ready," she said simply, a slight smile tugging at the corner of her mouth. "We faced the worst and survived. Together." Bonner looked at her, a deep sense of gratitude welling up inside him. He had never imagined that his life would lead him here, to this strange planet, fighting beside an alien warrior who had once been his enemy. But things had changed. They had both changed. "I don't know what the future holds," Bonner said, his voice steady now. "But I do know this. I'm not doing it alone." Zyra's smile grew, and for a moment, it felt like the entire world had stopped. They had been through so much, fought side by side, trusted each other when everything else seemed uncertain. They were allies now, bound by something stronger than just survival. Together, they turned away from the battlefield, making their way deeper into the jungle. Bonner didn't know where they were going, but it didn't matter. What mattered was that they were going together. They had survived the hardest fight of their lives, and now they had a chance to rebuild, to forge something new from the ashes of the past. As they walked, the sun began to set, casting a warm, golden glow across the sky. Bonner looked up at the stars, feeling a strange sense of peace settle over him. The stars were the same, no matter where you were. In the vastness of space, the universe had a way of making you feel small, insignificant even. But at the same time, it reminded you that anything was possible. Every star, every planet, every life had a story, a purpose. Maybe they had only just begun their own story. "I'm glad you're here," Bonner said, his voice sincere. Zyra looked at him, her expression softening. "You weren't supposed to be here either," she said with a chuckle. "But I'm glad you're here too." For a moment, they walked in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. But the silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was a quiet understanding, a shared experience that needed no words. They had fought together, and now they had earned their rest. They reached a small clearing, the perfect spot to set up camp for the night. The ground was soft and covered in moss, the air cool but not cold. Bonner started a small fire, the crackling flames casting flickering shadows around them. Zyra sat beside him, her posture relaxed, her eyes watching the fire as it danced. "This is nice," she said after a long pause, her voice thoughtful. Bonner looked at her and smiled. "Yeah, it is. For the first time in a long while, I feel like we're actually safe." Zyra chuckled softly. "Safe, huh? You know, I think we've earned a little peace." They both sat in silence for a while, the only sounds the crackling fire and the distant calls of creatures in the jungle. Bonner's mind kept drifting to the future, to the unknowns that lay ahead. But for now, he was content. He was with Xyra, and for the first time in what felt like forever, he wasn't alone. Eventually, Xyra broke the silence again, her voice gentle but firm. "We've still got a lot of work to do, Bonner. The war isn't over. There are more enemies out there." Bonner nodded, his gaze steady. "I know, but we've got each other. And we'll keep fighting. Together." Xyra smiled, her expression fierce yet warm. Together. The fire crackled as the night settled in around them. The stars above seemed to shine a little brighter, as if the universe itself was watching them, waiting for the next chapter of their story. Bonner knew there would be more battles ahead, more challenges to face. But for tonight, he could rest easy knowing that no matter what came next, he and Xyra were ready to face it, together. A new beginning was just on the horizon, and with it, a future filled with possibilities.